The scorching afternoon sun beat down on Silver Creek as Rosalie Granger stood her ground at the town meeting, her voice rising above the crowd of men who tried to silence her with their jeers and dismissive glances. It was 1878 in the Wyoming Territory, and a widow with opinions was about as welcome as a rattlesnake at a Sunday picnic. "Gentlemen, if I may continue," Rosalie persisted, tightening her grip on the edges of her black mourning dress that she'd worn for 3 years since losing her husband. "The water rights for the eastern pasture should not be granted exclusively to the mining company. The smaller ranchers will be driven to ruin." Mayor Thompson's face reddened beneath his bushy mustache. "Mrs. Granger, we've heard quite enough from you. A lady should know when to hold her tongue, especially on matters of business." Laughter rippled through the town hall. Rosalie felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up her neck, but she refused to lower her gaze. "A woman who speaks like a man ends up alone like one too," called out Thomas Benton, the banker who'd been pressuring her to sell her modest ranch for months. More laughter followed, crueler this time. From the back of the room, a deep voice cut through the mockery. "Seems to me the only ones showing poor manners are the men who'd rather laugh than listen." Heads turned toward the tall figure leaning against the doorframe. His face was partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson, but his posture radiated the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Dust from the trail still clung to his denim pants and leather vest. "And who might you be, stranger?" Mayor Thompson asked, clearly irritated by the interruption. The man stepped forward, spurs jingling softly with each deliberate step. "Hayes Zimmerman, just rode in from Colorado Territory." His eyes, an unsettling shade of blue against his sun-darkened skin, settled on Rosalie for a moment before returning to the mayor. "Where I come from, we value sense no matter whose mouth it comes from." Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Zimmerman, in Silver Creek, we have certain ways of conducting our affairs. And one of those ways is drowning out the one person making a lick of sense." Hayes interrupted, moving to stand near Rosalie. "I've been riding through ranching country for 15 years, and the lady's right. Give a mining operation exclusive water rights, and you'll have dead cattle and bankrupt ranchers by next summer." The room fell silent. Rosalie stared at the stranger, unable to decide if she should feel grateful for his intervention or angry that the same words from a man's mouth suddenly carried weight. "Perhaps we should consider Mrs. Granger's concerns more thoroughly," Councilman Edwards suggested tentatively, looking between the mayor and Hayes. Mayor Thompson's jaw tightened. "This meeting is adjourned until next week. We'll revisit the water rights issue then." As the crowd dispersed, muttering and casting glances at the newcomer, Rosalie gathered her papers with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman, but I've been fighting my own battles for some time now," she said quietly. He tilted his head slightly. "Never meant to suggest otherwise, madam. Just can't abide bullies, especially those hiding behind fancy titles." Rosalie looked up, searching his face for mockery but finding none. "Well, your timing was fortunate, though I doubt it's changed any minds permanently." "Maybe not, but I meant what I said." Hayes adjusted his hat. "Your voice is the one that made sense in that room full of fools." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and walked out into the blinding sunlight, leaving Rosalie to wonder about the strange cowboy who had, for a fleeting moment, made her feel heard. The next morning, Rosalie rose before dawn as she always did. Running the small ranch her husband had left her meant endless work, especially with only one hired hand, old Samuel, who was more loyal than capable these days. She pulled on her work clothes, pinned up her chestnut hair, and headed to the barn. The cows needed milking, the chickens needed feeding, and the fence on the north side wasn't going to repair itself. After 3 years of widowhood, the routine was familiar but no less exhausting. As she approached the barn, she noticed the door was already open, lantern light spilling onto the packed earth outside. Her heart jumped into her throat. Rustlers? Thieves, Rosalie grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the barn wall and stepped cautiously inside. Morning, Mrs. Granger, came a voice from near the milk cow's stall. Hayes Zimmerman looked up from where he was expertly filling the last bucket with fresh milk. Hope you don't mind. Samuel mentioned his joints were troubling him something fierce this morning, so I offered to help out. Rosalie lowered the pitchfork slowly. Mr. Zimmerman, I wasn't aware you and Samuel were acquainted. Met him at the saloon last night. He was worried about getting all the chores done with his hands cramping up the way they were. Hayes stood, wiping his hands on a rag. I told him I'd stop by. Man's got too much pride to accept help outright, so I may have implied you hired me. Rosalie fought between gratitude and indignation. I can't afford to hire another hand, Mr. Zimmerman, not asking for pay. He moved past her to grab a feed sack. Just need somewhere to stay for a spell while I figure out my next move. The hotel in town's more than I'd like to spend. She studied him skeptically. And in exchange you're offering labor. That's the general idea. He measured out feed for the chickens with practiced ease. I'm good with cattle, can fix most anything that breaks, and I don't talk more than necessary. Rosalie crossed her arms. Why would a man with your skills work for room and board when any big ranch would pay good wages? Hayes paused, something unreadable crossing his features. Big ranches mean big politics. I've had my fill of that. There was more to his story, Rosalie was certain, but she was in no position to turn down capable help, especially with the dry season approaching and water already becoming scarce. There's a room above the tack shed, she said finally. It's not much, but it's clean. Hayes nodded once. That'll do fine. As he walked past her toward the chicken coop, Rosalie caught herself watching the way he moved, confident but not cocky, strong but not threatening. It had been a long time since she'd had a man's presence on her property that didn't make her feel defensive. Mr. Zimmerman, she called after him. He turned. I still intend to speak at next week's town meeting. I wouldn't want you to think your help entitles you to silence me. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Mrs. Granger, your voice is about the only honest one in this town. I'd sooner silence a songbird. Days passed, and Hayes proved himself to be everything he'd claimed and more. He worked from sunrise until well past sunset, repairing fences, tending to the livestock, and even fixing the leaky roof that had plagued Rosalie since the previous winter. He was respectful but distant, joining her and Samuel for meals but sharing little about himself beyond occasional mentions of places he'd worked or horses he'd trained. By the fourth day, Rosalie found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he chopped firewood, his rhythmic movements hypnotic in the late afternoon light. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to notice a man in that way, the feeling was almost foreign, a mixture of guilt and a strange, fluttering anticipation whenever he was near. He's a good worker, Samuel observed, coming to stand beside her. The old ranch hand had been with the Grangers since before her husband died and was more family than employee. Yes, Rosalie agreed, quickly moving away from the window. We're fortunate he happened by. Samuel's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. Don't think it was happenstance, Miss Rosalie. Man like that doesn't just happen by anywhere. Before she could question him further, the door opened and Hayes entered, carrying an armload of split wood. Evening, he said, depositing the wood in the box by the fireplace. Should last a couple days. Thank you, Rosalie replied, suddenly very interested in the stew she was stirring. Dinner's almost ready. Hayes nodded and went to wash up at the basin on the porch. When he returned, they ate in companionable silence until Samuel, with exaggerated yawning, excused himself to his quarters in the converted tool shed. Left alone with Hayes, Rosalie found herself uncharacteristically tongue-tied. To her surprise, it was Hayes who broke the silence. Town meetings tomorrow, he said, pushing his empty plate aside. You still planning to speak your piece? Rosalie nodded. Someone has to stand up for the smaller ranchers. Most are too afraid of losing business with the bank or loans from Benton to speak against him. Hayes studied her with those penetrating blue eyes. What made you different? Most widows in your position would have sold out by now. This land was my husband's dream, she said softly. We came here with nothing but hope in each other. After he died, selling felt like giving up on both. Hayes leaned forward slightly. Your husband was a fortunate man. The simple statement, delivered without flattery or pretense, caught Rosalie off guard. Thank you, she managed, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. There's something you should know before tomorrow, Hayes said, his tone shifting. The mining company's already made arrangements with Mayor Thompson. The vote is just for show. Rosalie's eyes widened. How do you know this? Overheard Benton and the mayor talking at the saloon yesterday. They didn't notice me in the corner. His expression darkened. They're planning to make an example of you if you speak up again. Cold fear washed over her. What kind of example? The kind that involves foreclosure notices and suddenly discovering unpaid taxes on your property. Hayes's jaw tightened. They're scared of you, Rosalie, scared because others might start listening. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and despite the troubling news, Rosalie felt a small thrill at the sound of it on his lips. What should I do? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Hayes met her gaze steadily. Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you, but it's your choice, your fight. In that moment, looking into his eyes across the rough-hewn table, Rosalie felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to stand alone against powerful forces. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I'll need to think about this. Hayes nodded and rose from the table. Whatever you decide, you won't be standing alone this time. As he stepped out into the night, Rosalie remained at the table, her thoughts tumbling between fear for her future and the unsettling awareness that Hayes Zimmerman was becoming more than just a hired hand in her carefully ordered world. The town hall was packed tighter than the previous week, news of the confrontation having spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Rosalie sat rigidly in the front row, Hayes and Samuel flanking her like sentinels. She had barely slept, weighing her options and the potential consequences of speaking out again. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. First order of business is the water rights proposal from Western Mining. Mr. Benton will present the terms. Thomas Benton rose, straightening his expensive waistcoat with a self-satisfied air. Gentleman and lady, he added with a patronizing glance toward Rosalie, Western Mining is prepared to invest substantially in our community, bringing jobs and prosperity. All they require is exclusive access to the water from Silver Creek through the eastern pastures. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Most of the smaller ranchers looked down at their boots, avoiding eye contact. This arrangement would require some ranchers to adjust their operations, Benton continued smoothly, but Western Mining is prepared to offer fair compensation for any inconvenienced parties. Rosalie felt Hayes tense beside her. His hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to hers on the bench. Are there any questions before we put this to a vote? Mayor Thompson asked, already reaching for his gavel as if the outcome were predetermined. Rosalie stood slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have a question, Mayor Thompson. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some hostile, some fearful. Mrs. Granger, the mayor acknowledged with barely concealed irritation. Please be brief. Rosalie nodded, then addressed the room. My question is simple. How many of you received notices about property reassessments this week? A ripple of uncomfortable shifting spread through the room. Several of the smaller ranchers exchanged glances, or perhaps visits from Mr. Benton suggesting loans might be called in early. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Or hints from the mayor that certain ordinances might be enforced more strictly on your properties. Mayor Thompson slammed his gavel down. Mrs. Granger, these insinuations are completely out of order. Are they, Mayor? Hayes stood now, his presence commanding immediate attention. Because I've heard these same concerns from half a dozen ranchers since yesterday. Thomas Benton's face darkened. Who do you think you are, Drifter? You've been in town less than a week. Long enough to recognize corruption when I see it, Hayes replied evenly. And long enough to send telegrams to the territorial governor and newspaper in Cheyenne about your arrangement with Western Mining. A gasp went through the crowd. Mayor Thompson's face drained of color. You're bluffing, Benton sputtered. Hayes reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a receipt. Telegram sent yesterday afternoon mentioned how curious it was that tax assessments were being manipulated to force sales right before a mining deal. Chaos erupted in the town hall. Ranchers who had been silent now stood, voicing similar experiences of pressure and threats. The mayor banged his gavel frantically, trying to restore order. "This meeting is adjourned," he shouted above the din. "No vote will be taken today." As the crowd continued to argue, Hayes gently took Rosalie's elbow and guided her toward the door. Outside in the late afternoon sun, she finally released the breath she'd been holding. "You sent a telegram to the governor?" she asked incredulously. Hayes nodded. "And one to a friend at the Cheyenne Tribune. They'll be sending someone to investigate within the week." "You risked a lot," Rosalie said softly. "Benton and Thompson won't forgive this interference." Hayes's expression remained calm. "I've faced worse than small-town tyrants." "Why did you do it?" The question had been burning in her mind since he first stood up for her at the previous meeting. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the main street of Silver Creek. "My wife was like you," he finally said, his voice low. "Strong-minded, unwilling to be silenced. We had a small ranch in Colorado. When a mining company wanted our water rights, she spoke against them at every meeting." Rosalie felt her heart constrict. "What happened?" "There was a fire," he said, the words coming out flat and hard. "Official report said it was an accident. I was away delivering horses when it happened. By the time I returned, everything was gone, including her." "Hayes," Rosalie breathed, instinctively reaching for his hand. "I'm so sorry." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he released them. "That was 5 years ago. I've been drifting since, never staying anywhere long. Then I rode into Silver Creek, heard your voice in that meeting hall, and..." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Couldn't ride away this time." The vulnerability in his admission struck Rosalie to her core. This man who seemed so self-contained, so capable, had been carrying such pain. "What happens now?" she asked. Hayes turned to face her fully. "That depends on what you want, Rosalie. The investigation will likely put a stop to their immediate plans, but men like Benton don't give up easily." "And you," she pressed gently. "Will you stay?" Something flashed in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or fear. "Do you want me to?" Before she could answer, shouts erupted from the town hall behind them. Thomas Benton emerged, red-faced and pointing directly at them. "Zimmerman," he yelled. "You think you can threaten me? I own this town." Behind him, several rough-looking men emerged, not locals, but hired muscle by the look of them. "This isn't the place," Hayes said quietly to Rosalie. "Get Samuel and head back to the ranch. I'll be right behind you." "I'm not leaving you," Rosalie insisted, standing her ground as Benton and his men approached. Hayes's expression softened for a heartbeat. "Still speaking your mind, Mrs. Granger?" The corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile. "That's what I admire about you." Benton stopped a few paces away, his men fanning out behind him. "You've made a serious mistake, Cowboy. Nobody crosses me in my town." "Funny," Hayes replied calmly. "I don't see your name on the welcome sign." Several townspeople had gathered, watching the confrontation with wary eyes. Rosalie noticed Sheriff Miller approaching cautiously from across the street. "You sent those telegrams, you'll take them back," Benton demanded. "Or your widow friend here might find her ranch mysteriously catches fire." He smiled nastily. "Accidents happen after all." Hayes moved so quickly that Benton had no time to react. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the banker by his expensive lapels and slammed him against the nearest post. "Say that again," Hayes said, his voice deadly quiet. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." Sheriff Miller hurried forward. That's enough. Let him go, Zimmerman. Hayes released Benton, who straightened his jacket with shaking hands. You heard him threaten Mrs. Granger, Sheriff, Hayes said, in front of 20 witnesses. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. I didn't hear any specific threat. We all heard it, came a voice from the crowd. Jacob Porter, one of the smaller ranchers, stepped forward. Benton threatened Mrs. Granger's property, and I for one am tired of being bullied by him and the mayor. Murmurs of agreement rose from the gathering crowd. More ranchers stepped forward, emboldened by Porter's stand, Benton's face contorted with rage. This isn't over, he hissed, backing away. Not by a long shot. He gestured to his men, and they retreated toward the bank. Sheriff Miller looked between the retreating banker and the crowd, clearly conflicted about where his loyalties should lie. Sheriff, Rosalie said firmly, I'd like to file a formal complaint about the threat Mr. Benton just made against my property and person. Miller sighed heavily. Come by the office tomorrow, Mrs. Granger. I'll take your statement. As the crowd dispersed, Hayes turned to Rosalie. We should head back to the ranch. I don't trust Benton not to try something tonight. Samuel, who had remained silently supportive throughout the confrontation, nodded in agreement. I'll get the wagon ready. The ride back to the ranch was tense, all three scanning the landscape for any sign of trouble. When they arrived, Hayes immediately set about checking the perimeter of the property while Samuel secured the livestock. Rosalie stood on the porch, watching Hayes move with purpose around her land. The land she had fought so hard to keep, not just for her husband's memory now, but for herself, for the independence and dignity it represented. As dusk settled over the ranch, Hayes finally returned to the house. Everything looks secure, he reported, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch. But I'll keep watch tonight just to be safe. Rosalie studied his face in the fading light, the lines of determination around his mouth, the shadows of old pain in his eyes. You never answered my question, she said softly. Hayes looked at her questioningly. About whether you'll stay, she clarified. After this is resolved. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. I haven't belonged anywhere in 5 years, Rosalie. Wasn't looking to. Then I heard your voice in that meeting hall. And, she prompted when he paused. And it woke something in me I thought was dead. His voice was rough with emotion. If you're asking if I want to stay, the answer is yes, but the choice has to be yours. Rosalie felt her heart beating wildly in her chest. Since her husband's death, she had carefully guarded her independence, fearing that allowing anyone close would mean surrendering the strength she had worked so hard to build. But looking at Hayes now, she realized that sometimes strength meant having the courage to trust again. I'd like you to stay, she whispered. Not as a hired hand, but as... She faltered, uncertain how to express what she was beginning to feel. Hayes took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. As what, Rosalie? As a partner, she said finally. Someone who stands beside me, not above or below. Something in his expression shifted, a light kindling in those blue eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to her cheek. I've been wandering a long time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, looking for something without knowing what it was. His thumb brushed lightly across her cheekbone. I think maybe it was your voice I was waiting to hear. Rosalie leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When she opened them again, Hayes was looking at her with such intensity that it took her breath away. May I kiss you, Rosalie Granger? He asked, his voice low and reverent. Instead of answering, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like a question being asked and answered in the same breath. Then Hayes's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Rosalie saw her own wonder reflected in Hayes's eyes. I never expected this, she admitted. When you first spoke up for me in that meeting hall, Hayes smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. I just couldn't bear to see them silence the one voice that needed to be heard. A comfortable silence fell between them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its challenges: Benton's retaliation, the town's shifting alliances, the uncertain future of the water rights. But for now, standing on her porch with Hayes's arms around her, Rosalie felt a peace she hadn't known in years. "We should go inside," she said eventually. "It's getting cold." Hayes nodded but made no move to release her. "Rosalie," he said seriously, "whatever comes tomorrow or the day after, I want you to know that your voice, your thoughts, your feelings, your dreams, they'll always matter to me. Always." Rosalie reached up to touch his face, marveling at how quickly this man had become essential to her world. "And yours to me," she promised. As they turned to go inside, the ranch house glowing with warm lamplight against the gathering darkness, Rosalie knew that whatever storms might come, they would face them together, two strong voices finally finding harmony after years of singing alone. The next few weeks brought dramatic changes to Silver Creek. The territorial governor, responding to Hayes's telegram, sent an investigator who uncovered evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the water rights issue. Mayor Thompson resigned in disgrace when it was revealed he had accepted bribes not only from Western Mining but from several other companies over the years. Thomas Benton was forced to sell his interest in the bank and left town under the shadow of criminal charges. The water rights were eventually distributed equitably among all the ranchers, with strict limits placed on what the mining company could draw from Silver Creek. Rosalie found herself appointed to a newly formed town council, her voice now not just tolerated but actively sought for its wisdom and fairness. Through it all, Hayes remained by her side, their partnership deepening into a love that surprised them both with its intensity and ease. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony beneath the cottonwood trees on Rosalie's, now their ranch. Samuel, beaming with pride, gave away the bride, and Jacob Porter served as Hayes's best man. As winter settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing with it long evenings by the fire and quiet mornings watching snow dust the distant mountains, Rosalie often thought about how a single moment of courage standing up in that town meeting, despite the mockery and dismissal, had changed the course of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Hayes asked one evening as they sat side by side on the porch swing he had built, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Rosalie smiled, leaning into his warmth. "I was thinking about voices," she said. "How some try to silence others and how some choose to listen." Hayes took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "I'll always listen to yours," he promised. "It's the voice that brought me home." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rosalie rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that her voice, once mocked and dismissed, had found not only its strength, but also its perfect harmony in the heart of a man who had traveled across mountains and through sorrow to hear it. In the years that followed, the legend of the outspoken widow and the cowboy who stood by her would be told and retold throughout the territory. But for Hayes and Rosalie Zimmerman, the real story was written each day in the life they built together, a life where both their voices rang clear and true, neither one silencing the other, but instead creating something stronger, richer, and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone.